Radio check, anybody copy? Hi everyone, I'm Alice Cunny Glenn, and this is the continuation of Episode 7, so Episode 7 Part 2, Conversations with an Inuit Philosopher on Coffee and Quack. Coffee and Quack is a podcast I created to celebrate and explore contemporary native life in urban Alaska. I have some exciting news that I totally forgot to tell everyone on previous episodes, but Coffee and Quack episodes are now being played on KRFF 89.1 FM Voice of Denali, Suvat Fairbanks Mutes. Coffee and Quack episodes will also play on KBRW AM FM The Real People slot every so often. Shout out to the North Slope. And episodes will also play on KONR-LP 106.1 FM Out North Radio here in Anchorage. Woohoo! This episode, I continue my discussion with Warren Maaruk Jones, a self-proclaimed Inuit philosopher, among many other things. Warren is a steward of Northern philosophy, the idea that the North has its own unique epistemology, ethics, and more. This episode focuses on cultural traditions, awareness, the Yupik concept of yuuyaraq, cultural evolution, the traditional men's house, and religion. So, come on in, hang up your bongaks, and let's get back into it. Here, we start back up with traditional Alaska Native practices.
I mean, you're just talking about, like, this is the methodology, this is the way that you do things, right? You know, so, like, traditional dancing, right? Like, is traditional Inuit dancing really that different from line dancing? Like, I mean, sure, intention, but, like, think about the abstraction, the literal things that you're doing. Dancing is dancing, you know? And our dancing was prayer, but I think all dancing is prayer. I just don't think that we know what we're praying for, you know? And so then, like, traditional foods, right? So whether or not it's tortilla soup or seal soup, I mean, it's the same thing, right? It's just different contexts, right? So traditions is a part of culture, right? But to me, it's not the most important part of culture, right? Like, we do things differently for lots of different reasons. You know, is the ulu the defining aspect of our culture? No. But you know what it is? It's a damn good representation because it's a damn good tool which tells you that the people that made it were probably pretty smart, you know? And when you put it in the context that it was created in, like the kayak and things like that, I mean, like, it tells you a lot about the culture, right? But the traditions aren't the culture, but they're so closely related, like, you know, these things are hard to tease apart, right? So, you know, it's like differentiating the core from the apple, right? Can you pull the core out without destroying the thing itself? But you can distinguish it, right? You can say that's the core, that's the apple without destroying it, right?
Yeah.
These are parts of the same thing.
Well, it's also like philosophy and culture. Are they mutually exclusive? Or are they, you know, they're in tandem? Or culture comes from?
I think philosophy has to be just a natural out, having a soul or whatever you want to call it, right? Like the fact that you're in there, right? And that you're seeing this world and you need to and you want to make sense out of it, right? This is one of the problems that we're having today is that I really don't think, and I'm going to kind of make a really broad assertion here, but the way that I see millennials is basically it's that you're just being handed this total shit plate, you know, like, and none of it makes any sense, and there's no rhyme or reason, you know, like why the fuck would we do things this way? Whose idea was this? This is terrible, you know, like, and I agree with it, you know, and I'm like living it, and I bought into it, you know, and I was like, I was gonna live the American dream, you know, I was like, I'm gonna get a hot wife, big truck, big car, you know, and it's like, oh, none of those things are making me happy, you know. So one of the assertions that I make, and I'm super comfortable defending this, is that awareness was the central tenet of, like, arguably all Inuit cultures. And what does that mean, right, to have awareness? And so, like, sometimes I think, like, philosophy is just, like, an extended awareness. Because if you think about it, even, like, going back to guys like Descartes with the cogito ergo sum dude, right? I think therefore I am, right? You know, like, he went through and he applied, like, this radical skepticism to everything, right, in an attempt to, like, understand and to just mitigate and make sense of the world around him. And the process by which he did that was through a process of self-awareness. And this is something that was just completely like an integral part of our culture, where you were taught awareness and self-awareness from the time you were born. You know, it was modeled for you. It was part of every story. Like, And it was super important for you to have this in this context, right? A, because you live in an environment that's so crazy that, like, if you're not paying attention, you're going to die. And B, when you live in that kind of environment in a community of human beings, hey, tensions and emotions run high. You got to have awareness, right? The joke example that I give here, because I talk about this in the context of Indigenous leadership, right? One of the most important things for you to have as an Indigenous leader is awareness, right? You need to have awareness both of you. What are your strengths and what are your weaknesses as a leader? Like, what kind of person are you? What sort of pitfalls are you vulnerable to, right? You know, these sorts of things. And then you have awareness of your place in your community, your role and your responsibility, and whether or not it's appropriate for you to step out of that. You're having an awareness in general. And when you have an awareness of things, people don't need to tell you when things are wrong because you already know it, because you were paying attention. Same thing in relationships. I don't need my wife to tell me when she's mad at me. Usually need to even tell her to tell me why she's mad at me. I know, because I pay attention. Doesn't always mean I give a shit, but you know what I mean? You try to have awareness of these sorts of things. And, like, this is the dynamic that I see in my whole family, too, is that there's this expectation of awareness. Don't ask me stupid questions that you can answer yourself, because those are irritating, you know. And that, like, I don't like constantly explaining every little bit of myself. Like, you should just know it at this point. When you have an entire culture that's centered around awareness, the manifestation is crazy different. It's like Plato's dream. Seriously. Which, again, not to say that we were perfect, right? But you had a society where you had a governance structure that was self-imposed, where everybody knew the rules and laws and kept themselves accountable to it, right? And if you were a leader, that didn't mean that it was your job to hold other people accountable. It meant that it was your job to hold yourself the most accountable and to provide the example for the other people, and it was incumbent on everybody else to hold themselves responsible to our values. And that's a beautiful system, because that's a system where you police yourself. And you're not a perfect, well, you know, you can't judge yourself perfectly, right? And this is where the leaders do come in, right? But they taught with gentleness, you know, and things like that. Again, you put it in the context. The world that they exist in was so hard, why you got to be a dick?
And that's what I want to touch on, too, because at the same comments that I was telling you about, there was a question, because I talked about social structures in Inuit culture, and it was largely based on whaling crews, and how there's a whaling captain and then there's a crew, and you have to work your way up. All of these, you know, astrophysicists and like all these people, they're like, well, don't you think that's like a dictatorship? And I was like, no. Yeah. That thought didn't even pop into my head.
It's like on its head, though, right? Like, it's like, no, as a matter of fact, the whaling captain is like more accountable than anybody on his entire crew. So, I mean, that's the example I would like to give. So, like, the leader that I aspire to be is my great-grandpa, because the stories that are told to me about him, right? So, like, Harold Napoleon, the guy that wrote yuuyaraq, right? Like, he's a relation of mine, not really distantly. Like, he knew my great-grandpa. Harold Napoleon remembers the men's house, right? And he remembers being in there. And when he talks about, like, his grandpa and my great-grandpa, like, the reverence in his voice is clear, right? And all the stories I hear about this guy are the same. You know, it's like my mom told me that her whole entire life that she never once heard him raise his voice, right? And she said when he was mad, he still didn't raise his voice. She said, but it sure felt like it was thundering anyway, you know, and that was because of the weight of his character, of who he was. His word meant so much, but not because he said so, and not because everybody voted him. It was because of who he was, right? People trusted his wisdom. He had strength of character. He had generosity. You know, like, he was kind. Like, they were leadership qualities, right? And the reason why he was a leader? Because he was a leader, right? That's why. Right? And I do think that happens. Like, we have leaders that are leaders in this country, right? But we also kind of have this, like, weird upside-down system where a lot of the people that should be leaders aren't leaders, and a lot of people that shouldn't be leaders are leaders, right? And it's like, because we don't have a system that rewards honesty.
You mean in Western?
Yeah, in Western, yeah. Well, I mean, look, Western culture is fucked, but so is ours. Like, we're in a real shitty place, right? Like, what you were talking about earlier, like, I got the opportunity to give a talk about another one about leadership, right? And I was talking about Indigenous leadership to Indigenous people, right? And I was saying the metric by which we're judged as leaders is how are your people doing, right? That's the only metric that matters, right? And if they're not doing well, then you're failing as a leader, which means that we're failing as leaders, all of us. All of us purported leaders are failing, right? Because the state of your people is the only metric that matters, and we're doing it everywhere. Very few bright spots, right? Very few leaders. Again, not really their fault. Like the tribal leaders in most communities, they're the only people that would step up. And they didn't even necessarily want to. Maybe there's a leadership vacuum. I mean, think about like the brain drain and things like that, you know? Like, do you think that if I lived in Hooper Bay, I wouldn't be one of the leaders? Of course I would be. I'm pushy and loud. You know, okay, that's not why I'm a leader. But that it certainly helps in this culture, right? Like, this is one of the things that I've learned to do. And it works really well for me, right? Like, I know when to be assertive, I know when to be loud, and I know when I can get away with it, and I know when it's going to work for me, right? You know, and these are things that stand in for actual authority in the Western system, right? Like, you don't actually have to have authority. You just got to act like it. You got to, like, make it seem that way, you know? Another really good example of why and when cultural differences are important and when we should focus on them, right? Because, like, we're talking about leadership here, and this is one of the most important things that we're facing right now is that we do, I think, have a vacuum of leadership, which is not to, like, overtly criticize the people that are currently leading, right? Because I understand, like, heavy lies the crown, right? Like, these are the people that have made the choice, and you know what? They're doing more than most people. And so I'm not trying to, like, be that sort of criticism, but the real question is that as leaders, how are we doing? And if what we're doing isn't working, well, then what do we do? And how do we do it? I don't want to just talk about men's houses. I want to build men's houses. I don't want to just talk about sovereignty. I want to assert it. You know, and not just in some like weird kind of piecemeal, you know, assert it through the Western system sort of thing. It's like, no, true Yupik governance doesn't look anything like Western governance. True Yupik governance is yuuyaraq. True Yupik governance is you knowing and understanding your own cultural values and holding yourself accountable to them, right? This is what the important part about culture is, this part, right? All the other parts are important too, right? Like, again, the traditions, the environment, like all these things are part of it and they're super important. But like, to me, the reason why traditions are important is because of what they teach you about that culture, right? Like the guy was saying, it's like, you know, how culture treats their dogs can tell you a lot about a culture, right? And I agree with him, right? Because you know what that tells you about white culture? They think their dogs are humans? I don't know. You know, like right? You know, but you know, say like, I mean, it is really weird, right? You know, because it's like, I mean, that was the context I grew up in. You know, and I treat my dogs, you know, pretty well. But then there's this level of like, you know, like I said, when I was growing up, like the dogs weren't in the house. The dogs got fed leftovers. They were chained up. They were, you know what I mean? Like they were working animals. They were not
exactly
necessarily pets. You know, and they served a purpose, right? Like. Yeah. They serve a real purpose out in the bush.
And I think that's part of their enjoyment of life, too, is serving a purpose.
Oh, God.
Right? Like
Huskies are so happy when you like let them do what they want to do. Like, when they're out in the snow, when they're running around, when they're pulling a sled, they love that shit, you know? And, like, even, like, labs, love it. Well, and I think that's also important to be said is that we can reject some of our traditional teachings and values if they don't serve us well. Right. You know, like you should think very hard about doing things like that. But like, you know, there's some problematic in our culture and our history. And then again, I think this is probably part of the reason why we kind of do get dehumanized in some ways because we don't want to talk about these sorts of things. You know, but there's like the superhuman parts about us.
So we have like the set of Inuit values, right, in the slope or whatever. We have these set of values, too, that they rejected. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I know this because I used to work at UIC, which is my village corporation in Barrow, and there's an anthropologist, Kari, and he was telling me about, like, these crazy values that Inuit used to have back in the day. And they're like, no one talks about them anymore. We rejected them, but they're in a book somewhere. And he's like, you got to read this book. And I'm like, I need to read this book. It's so interesting.
Think about it, right? This isn't our and I hope none of them get too up in arms about it, right? But Tlinkits were slavers. And the Ununga people haven't forgot it, like to this day. But this isn't like passing judgment on them, right? No. Again, this is like this recognition that we're human,
it's
you know?
Time.
And that is something that you can reject. You can be like, nah, you know what, like this is not something that we're going to continue forward, right? You know, that for very good reasons that we have decided that this is no longer going to be part of our culture. Because cultures aren't static. right? And they shouldn't be. They have to be able to change, to be able to fit new data, new schemes, right? You know, like again, how does our culture inform us about how to